Kate, what's up?
Hi,
Welcome to the
Abby.
podcast. How
It's
are you?
so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I said this to you, but you were and are one of my top guests of like, I need to interview Kate because of your career and what you're doing and where you've gone. And I love it. So I'm really excited to talk to you today. Um,
Well, I'm truly flattered and honored to be here.
can you introduce yourself to the audience in whatever way you want to take that? Please tell us who
Sure.
you are.
Yeah, I'm Kate. I'm just a simple girl from Buffalo who fell in love with the outdoors when she was very little. And I would say I have spent my career and journey trying to leave the world a little better off than I found it. And right now, that's taking the shape of being a climate policy professional, climate advocate, policy nerd are all good interchangeable terms for what I do. And I also continue to sort of stoke the flame of love for the outdoors and nature through running and hiking and spending lots of time with my very active dog in the outdoors. So, dog mom, family member, partner, sister, um, you know, daughter are all really important ways that I describe myself, as well as friend and member of the community. But that's me in a nutshell,
I
put very
love
boldly.
that. No, that's great. I too introduce myself like that, like a daughter, sister, sibling. That is really important identity for me, and I know it is for you too. So, I mean, we met. I was actually thinking about this, Kate. We met like 12 years ago. Is that right? That's
That
pretty
sounds right.
wild.
Yeah,
Okay, through running, which we'll get
time is
into.
flying.
But I was just thinking about that as you were introducing yourself, and I was like, gosh, we have known each other for so long. And I met you and your sister, speaking of your identity and intro, at the same time through
Yes.
running.
Shout out
Um,
home.
yeah, exactly. Who also works in climate.
That's right.
Um,
We could have done a
we
three-way
could.
pod, but
Oh,
next time.
next time. Okay, that's a
Next
great.
time.
That was a great idea. But I also want to talk to her too. I mean, you both have since knowing you, you both have kind of migrated, or in your case, I feel like gone into environment. You've been in environment for so long. You're probably one of my first friends that like solidly worked in environment. A lot of people have come over, including myself, kind of come over to the space. But I was curious to ask you kind of the introduction question that I ask all the folks that come on this podcast is around this idea of, your aha moment on climate or environment
Yeah.
more broadly, but like what was that for you if you can remember?
Yeah, I tried to reflect on this a little bit, and it's a great question because I feel like it's a little hard because I am someone who's always like deeply, deeply cared about the environment. And a former colleague of mine put it in the way of like, what is the place that sort of imprinted your love for nature on
Mm.
you? And so I grew up in Buffalo. We used to spend a week every summer in the Adirondack Mountains. And I feel like that's my like imprint place. My family would go up there and we would go stay at a very rustic hiking camp. And in retrospect, like nothing about this was a vacation, but we like spent the whole time hiking like every single day, really long, taxing hikes, or at least they felt that way at the time as a little kid, in the Adirondack 46 high peaks, if people are
Mm.
familiar with what those are. And that's the place that I feel like is sort of at the core of my like love for nature and the environment. But I feel like there was one, and I sort of pursued that interest throughout high school. I was very lucky to go to a school where I could take a lot of like really interesting environmental sciencey classes, and became like really sort of a nerd about like marine biology and birds, all of the species and awesome things that there are outdoors. But there was, and I started to learn about climate in that context. This was like the mid 2000s, and climate was like a growing and growing topic of
Mm.
conversation, coming on Obama's first term. And when I was applying to colleges, my dad snipped out an article from the New York Times, as he tended to do a lot when we were little. Um, and he gave it to me one day when I was in the process of like filling out college applications. And it was an article about a small island nation. And I think it might have been the Maldives, but it doesn't, I mean, it might have been others. I can't quite remember the specifics, but it was one of the countries where sea level rise was like a very near
Hmm.
term imminent threat to, the safety and sort of future of the community there. And I feel like that was like a snap in moment where I was like, this is not just a problem that's sort of about protecting nature and all the places that I love. Like, this is a problem that's affecting communities and people
Hmm.
and will increasingly do so over time. And in a way that is like so unjust that it sort of hurts my soul, because that is like, an example of a nation that has contributed almost nothing to the climate problem and is like bearing the most immediate near term and really like unsolvable impacts of it, right? With implications for migration, et cetera. So I wrote like a college application essay around that, and I feel like that was kind of a pivot point for me, and I sort of took it from there in terms of really trying to lean into this issue and what I could study in undergrad, and then focus my career on it. But that's one, like, it may not have been like the one, but it was definitely an important and memorable moment in the trajectory of all of this, which I think has just been sort of a snowball for me.
Yeah, wow. That's super interesting and a very specific aha moment. Like a very, I can visualize it, and yeah, my dad does the exact same thing actually. So I can relate. Yeah, exactly. Or now I live across the country from him and he'll send me like mail
Yeah.
me a kind of like a
Yes.
magazine or an article and like with little earmarks and stuff. But I think, I mean, what's interesting too is like, as you said, your sense of place and your connection to the outdoors obviously fueled an initial love and interest in environment and environmental protection. And though it's also really interesting to hear you say that, I mean, it's such like, I know you very, or I've known you for a long time and feel like this is something that you exhibit always, but the level of empathy for like a young person to be able to read about something halfway across the world and say like, okay, so it's not just impacting me, like that's a part of it, but it's also really impacting these nations already and these communities that, as you said, don't they don't necessarily contribute to climate change at all, honestly, like even according to like science and many statistics, and they're bearing the brunt of the impacts. And so yeah, it's I'm really grateful actually to you for talking about that, because I think that's something that a lot of folks that work more maybe more internationally see, and yet it's hard day to day to be like in our own bubbles and silos and in doing a lot of the outdoor activities we do. And it's like that's part of the conversation I want to connect folks to, like, if you care about the environment, here, like if you care about the trails you run on, like here's how you can get
Yeah.
involved. But it's also like, let's broaden it out and realize that like there's communities all over the world that are already like really feeling it. I mean, we are starting, of course, we're feeling it here too. We're seeing climate change impacts, but there's something about, having that level of empathy and knowledge about folks on the other side of the world who are, experiencing this as well. So very interesting.
Yeah.
And again, like very much a visual I can picture of like, that being a pretty impactful aha moment at that age. It sounds like 17 or 18, possibly.
Yeah, it definitely was. And I feel like there's no wrong way to connect with the problem. I'm very much like, I feel like I get on my soapbox sometimes in talking about this issue where I'm like, find the ways to connect with people over your sort of shared values, and find ways to sort of connect that back to climate, if that's an issue that's
Mm-hmm.
important to you and you want to sort of drive awareness and progress on it. There are a million ways in which, like, people's children are important to them, sort of the future that they leave for them, where people run on the trails, like, is it going to be
Yeah.
90 degrees in Boston next year? Like, whatever way it is that sort of resonates for you and the people you're talking with, there's no wrong way to
Right.
connect with the problem. And then you start to learn and understand more about it, and like, there obviously a lot of other dimensions and ramifications that become like compelling, or at least they did to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you also mentioned equity too, and kind of the yeah, the like deeply, like it's hard to even talk about in some of the cases of realizing like how much, how much of an impact. And I know it's funny because we mentioned Allison. Al is in, I think, Australia, like working on climate, again, halfway
Yeah.
across the world, and probably a very different context. But it's really interesting when, and it's not just halfway across the world. My point is like the equity issues around climate are also like right in front of us, like right here in
Right.
the US. That's no
Yeah.
secret. And so I think it's that's something I always want to try to bring into the conversation. And like part of the thesis of this project is also like, yes, let's talk about climate in the outdoor industry. Let's also take a second to realize the outdoor industry is like extremely homogenous. As I don't need to tell anyone that. That's like a very sort of something that like I know there's been progress, but it's also at the same time, we have a long way to go there too. So,
Yeah.
um, but I am curious. So as I mentioned, like I feel like you were one of my earlier friends. Like I remember talking to you, meeting you in DC, and realizing I was like, oh yeah, like not only is this girl super rad, but also works in environment. And like how I'm curious after you did go and study climate and environment, like a little, you don't have to, you can take this how you want to, but like, your kind of career trajectory, and we'll get into like what you do now in a bit, but I'm curious how you found your way through kind of like working in environment and what that meant to you. And
Mhm.
yeah, just kind of like where you went after school.
Yeah. So I feel like there's like the starting line. I'm not going to be too cheesy about like
No,
metaphors
no,
related
that's
to
great.
running, but as I was thinking about
Let's
this
do it.
conversation, I was like, there are so many.
Yeah, there are. This is
um,
great.
the like starting line for me in my career was sort of a decision between working. I mean, I was offered jobs at a couple different consulting firms, and one was like really specialized in the environment. I mean, like
Hmm.
any good DC graduate, the trajectory was consulting. One
Yeah.
was like focused on the environment and environmental policy, and one was focused on just generalized sort of management consulting. And those were the two like trajectories I was choosing between. And there was a difference in pay, but
Sure.
I like just to say like it's the less natural career path that I think a lot of people think about. And of course, I fully support and understand why people make career decisions for financial reasons. I was very grateful and lucky to have sort of the flexibility to make a slightly different decision.
Hmm.
Um, but at the time, like that wasn't a huge factor. It was like, do I go with my gut or do I go with sort of what everyone else around me is doing?
Yeah.
And this changes drastically depending on the school you're coming out of. But, you know, not like I'm some amazing, like anti status quo person, but like there is like a sort of momentum and energy that I think builds for, following a path that's similar
Yeah.
to your peers. And it was a really tough decision. And I was like, I know I care about the environment. I know I want to work on this. My dad was also very helpful on this decision. He was like, this is it. This is your first job. This is very like unimportant in the grand scheme of things. So like, go,
But it's hard to hear that when you're at that
it's
age,
very
because
hard
people
to
say that, and I say that now to people too, and they're like, "Well, but do you remember how it was kind of a big deal at the time?"
it
Yeah.
feels like the biggest deal,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Anyway, that's long-winded, but I ultimately like stuck with the gut feeling that I had that working on the environment was the central thing that was most important to me, and I wanted to do that for the rest of my life. So I started working for that firm, very classic DC firm. We were focused on EPA facing stuff, a lot of environmental regs, mostly in the sort of hazardous waste and environmental cleanup space, which is, I would say, like one, lane of the environmental policy world. But people may be familiar with the Superfund Act and like brownfields program. So industrial hazardous waste related things. And it was super interesting experience. I got to wear a lot of different hats, really small organization. And again, this was sort of like Obama first term, climate, a second term at this point. Climate was really like picking up. and it was like clean power plan days. And I was like, that's the issue. Like, that's the issue I
Mm,
need to be working on. I'm so like grateful for the experience in the environmental policy space and understanding environmental law a little bit better as I was doing at that job. But I was like, I need to find a way to work on climate. And that was like the top line thing that I
hmm,
sort of directed my energy into. And I pivoted from the private sector consulting side of things into the nonprofit space. I went to work for the Nature Conservancy in with their climate policy programs, mostly focused in the U.S. But I worked sort of at the U.S. federal level. I spent some time working on global policy and programs, and spent some time there working at the state level as well. So I got to see a number of different sides of climate policy and strategy and programming. And I was there for 7 years, so I wore a lot of different hats and had a lot of different types of roles, but they sort of straddled like policy and program management. And then I started to specialize more into like policy and advocacy, and really got excited about like going in that direction. And made the sort of strategic decision for myself that I really wanted to work at the state level. And I'm happy
hmm.
to talk more about that. But I am now with the Environmental Defense Fund, very similar global organization focused on tackling climate change, very much focused on like what are the policies we need to put in place to drive down emissions. So happy to talk more about what it is I'm doing now. But that was kind of the arc of
Yeah.
my career trajectory so far.
Yeah. And I definitely want to talk about state level policy given the time we're in now. But before we talk about the current role that you have, I also want to like parallel path this and talk about your identity as a runner. Because and then again, like selfishly, because we met um, through a running group, November Project in DC. And I feel like it's so funny to call it a running group, because there's like so many other things. Like I feel like there's like the strength workout side of it and the kind of like, circuit workout format, but also because now I count some of my like close friends in life as like people I've met at November Project, but people will be like, how did you and like
Yeah.
Kaylin meet? And I'm like, oh yeah, through a running group in DC. But it's all these people that I've still remained in touch with that I feel so grateful for that group to bring us all together. Um, but I know that like
Yeah.
you've not only at that time were like, I feel like a lot of us got like way into running races and setting big goals, but you've continued on, I feel like, as a runner, as someone who, does like not only does races, but also is really avid about being outside, being, whether that's like on a road or on the trail. Can you talk a little bit more about like how
Mhm.
your running journey has evolved through the years since we've met?
For sure. Yeah. I've continued on because I set big goals and I didn't meet them, so I had to keep trying.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I got into running shortly before we met, as sort of like a parallel endeavor to college sports. I was on the rowing team as a
Oh,
coxswain,
that's
and
right.
I sort of got into running out of like, I was a non-athletic member of an athletic team, and I really wanted to explore the actual athletic side of things. And running was a nice like way to decompress from everything that I was juggling in school and with the team and everything. And I decided to sign up. I'm one of those people who like was not an athlete, was not a runner, and then decided to sign up for a marathon. So the start of my running journey was like, okay, let's just see how far I can go. Like, and every time I like went for a longer and longer run, I was like really excited about it. To the point where I decided it was a good idea to just put a date on the calendar and try to train for a marathon, when I
What
was
was
like
your first
a
one?
junior in college.
Okay.
It was the Washington, D.C. At the time, it was a rock and roll D.C. marathon in the spring.
Nice. So not
Yeah.
okay. So that and there was there a half with that one too? It was like the full and the half,
Hmm. Yeah,
and then
yeah,
there was
yeah.
Marine Corps, which was in the fall.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've never done Marine Corps, but Yeah, that was the start of the journey. Just like rip the band-aid off, go straight to the
Yeah,
marathon. Um,
totally. As one does.
luckily
Yeah.
it was a fine experience for me. I finished around my goal time and I was happy with it. And then I just kind of got the bug. I'm like such a classic stereotypical case of, the person who does one marathon and then is like, oh, I could get faster. Oh, I could get close to the Boston qualifying time. And it just that's basically what
Slippery
the
slope.
trajectory has
Yeah.
been for me from there. But like not just because I feel like aiming for some arbitrary time goals, but because I love the process and I love like having a race on the calendar, having that sort of help organize and orient me in terms of a training plan and the structure of that in life. And then the ways that I've obviously connected with people like you and so many others through running has been like the fuel that keeps me going. So not to like be again cheesy about the
No,
the
please.
climate parallels here, but that is like a fundamental reflection I was having on this conversation is like the way that you start, the way that team can sort of propel you in sport is so similar to the way that I have found that like the people you meet in climate work and like the work that I do every day, the people that I get to engage with on my team and sort of partners and lawmakers and all the other actors in the space, like that is the thing that keeps me going on like very challenging issues. And on the running front, I feel like that, like I starting 12 years ago or 10 years ago or so was like aiming at the Boston qualifying time. And I ran a marathon a year for almost 10 years before
Whoa.
I achieved the Boston qualifying time. And what truly sort of like unlocked it for me was starting to really train regularly with a team in Philadelphia here. Shout out to Philly Runner Track Club. Um, and that was the thing that like just got me out of my own head and kept me
Mm,
motivated and kept me like getting out the door. So I'm being like going off on a bit
no,
of a tangent
that's
there,
great.
but I think like the arc of my running career has been like classic stereotypical gets hooked on the marathon decides to make it her core hobby, and then like just chipping away and chipping away and getting really close and falling short, and then like finding a really awesome community of runners here in Philadelphia that sort of unlocked the BQ time for me. Like I don't even give myself credit because it was so much
Wow.
about like being part of that team and being part of the training environment. And I finally did qualify for Boston a couple of years ago, and then I ran it last spring.
Okay.
The story of that race is like I had the flu and it was 75 degrees, and I had a really good
Oh.
time because I just pulled back all
The
expectations. I was like,
expectations were so low.
we're just gonna go out and see if we can run a few miles. And I made it
Yeah.
all the way to the finish line, and that was like a great day.
That's amazing. Oh my God. Yeah, sometimes when you just have like actually no expectations, like not even low, just like none, then,
Yeah.
you see what you can do with it.
Yeah,
Did
I was
you
standing on the
ever,
starting line with a friend. We were like slathering ourselves in sunscreen, and I was like, I'm already too hot. We're on the starting line, and I'm already too hot.
oh boy, haven't started moving yet? Just like classic.
It's not
I
good.
mean, 75 was it 75 like that early in the morning? Or I guess Boston starts
No,
like
I
kind of late,
think by
right?
yeah, it starts pretty late for like
For
later
a
waves.
race. Yeah.
I don't remember actually what time we were starting at, but I
Mm.
think it was probably like in the 60s when we were starting and like approaching the 70s. Someone
Still
can fact
not a
check
temperature
me on
you,
this and like
yeah.
maybe
We'll
I
have
might be
someone be like,
dramatizing this. It was a hot day though. Like it
no,
was a
I
very
remember that. Yeah, I remember
yeah.
hearing about that. I was gonna ask if you ever did any of the. Do you remember those like North Face TNF like
Oh
relay
yeah. Yeah.
runs?
Didn't
Did
we
you
do one
ever?
together?
Yeah, I was gonna say. I feel like did we? Oh wait, I think we were we either
You
on
were
the same
probably on a
team?
much faster team.
No. Do you remember this? I think there were like two teams. and we both figured out that like we were gonna be like pretty equal. And then I
Mm.
got lost, dude. Do you remember this?
Oh
I think
shoot.
you were
Yeah, I
on the
kind of do.
other okay, I think you were on the other team. And it was one of those where it was
Yeah.
like I think I had like Kyle on my team. It was like we had sort of like a both teams felt like the times would be very, very similar, like based on everyone's kind of running ability. And we were like, okay,
Yeah.
like may the best team win. And then Addie goes 2 miles out of the way on a 6 mile track and just fucks it up for everybody. So it was great. Great day.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a fun, but those were like I feel like those were like, I don't know, for me, that was kind of like how I got into trail actually, was like those races being so like I feel like we were all like doing the kind of November Project road running
Yeah.
marathon goals. And then someone at some point was like, let's go run this thing in the woods. And I was like, okay, that sounds great. And then we all went to
Yeah.
like, where was that? Like Wisconsin? I think that was in
Yeah, we
Madison,
went
I
to
want to say.
Wisconsin
Was
for
that the
one of
one?
the
Okay.
NP
Yeah, yeah,
summits,
yeah.
but we also did the North Face races, I think, in Virginia. There was somewhere right
Yeah.
outside DC.
That was my first ultra,
Um,
was the one in, forget the park, but it was the one you're talking about. The one like right outside
yeah.
DC. Yeah.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was,
Yeah,
that was a fun
I
experience.
feel like I've had to get like the Boston monkey off my back and have been like very road marathon and road
Yeah.
running focused because of it, but every time I go for a trail run, I'm like, I love this so much. This is exceptional. And it's like the best combination of, like truly being in the outdoors and in nature and like athletics. So I'm excited to explore that more when I
Yeah.
get back into running after having a child soon.
Oh yeah. Okay. So maybe this is a good segue. Before we get into your current role, let's also talk about another thing that's happening in April. You're
Yes.
due to have a child that month.
Yes.
How are you feeling? I mean, there's so many questions I have. We chatted a little bit before we started recording, but like, I know as a climate professional, it sounds like you thought a lot about like what it meant to bring a child into the world. And I was just curious, like, if you could say more about that, because I'm constantly having those conversations, as I mentioned, specifically with women, like a lot of conversations around this. And I'm just curious, yeah, like how like what that mind space is for you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a question I've thought a lot about, and I'm feeling good. Thank you. It's all very exciting and feels
So
like a new
exciting.
world is about to open up,
Yeah.
and that it's also happening very soon. So I'm starting to feel that a little bit as well, but all good things aside from the insomnia. So
Oh, right. Yes.
I'm just gonna caveat all of my hand waving and like incoherent thoughts under the
With deep
category of like
insomnia.
pregnancy brain and
Yep.
insomnia.
Totally.
Aside from that, feeling great, very excited, and yes, have definitely thought a lot about sort of the future and climate in the context of on deciding about whether to have children. And I would say like after a lot of conversations and a lot of, there are so many sides to this. To me, it's
Yeah.
never really been about like my impact on the world in terms of like
Mm-hmm.
a person that's going to consume more. It's more about what is the world that
Yeah.
child will inherit, what is the suffering they will experience and or see.
Yeah.
Um, and what I feel like really like tipped the scales for me or sort of is where I'm at now. And obviously having made this decision, um, is that it's like one of the most optimistic moves you can make
Mm.
is to have a kid. And like I think it's both optimistic and motivating. I'm not there yet, but I expect it will be very motivating to me in my career, and in the ways that I sort of try to live my life, to really feel like I am truly trying to like leave the world better off for the generations that come after me. And I also think like those of us who care deeply about the planet and climate and environmental issues are going to like pass those values on to our children, and that's important. And so it's a great opportunity to perpetuate those
Mm-hmm.
values, and to raise kids who will be, both like resilient to the extent possible and sort of be brought up in a world like understanding the depth of this problem, but also, maybe want to like be very thoughtfully contributing to how to solve it. Um, I think like the alternative path of just being like, I'm going to pour myself into climate work and, like be sort of a martyr or
Mm-hmm.
decide not to have kids because I don't want to like distract myself from the work. That's like, those are some of the tensions that I was grappling with. But I feel like ultimately, like, I recognize at the end of the day that I am one small person working on this enormous global problem. And I'm going to do everything that I can against that problem. And I think like having kids and sort of spreading those values and deriving the motivation from that choice, felt like the most
Hmm.
compelling to me. But it's a tough
Yeah.
decision, and it's definitely, you can hear it as I'm like talking
Yeah.
about it in sort of a broken way. It's definitely something that I've like spent a lot of time thinking about.
I have no doubt knowing you, and I really appreciate you sharing your thought process on that because it is so hard. And yeah, that was not to like come down and you be like, oh, you're having a kid? Like, why? Like, no, but it is so, I
I
mean,
told you it was
yeah, no,
totally
no, you
fair to ask.
that was yeah, we should also mention that you were going to talk about that. But I think I really also appreciate what you said. It helped me to reframe things about like it's not my decision was not around like having a person and bringing a person into the world and having them consume things and making the problem worse. It's like how are they going to be impacted by sort of the world that we're leaving or that we're handing to future generations. And I
Yeah.
think that is, I mean, because I've heard both, right? I've heard people say both sides of it of like, definitely what you just said of I'm worried about like a child, raising a child in this world and like having them outlive me and then be experiencing that climate impacts that everyone's talking about now, like of, the later years where they're going to be inheriting these problems. And I also have heard people sort of say like, well, population control or like it's sort of like this, the like the amount of people in the world and how we're treating the planet. It's like, well, the whole point I really think is, as you said, you know, if we're teaching sort of habits and sustainable lifestyles for the buzzword that is, but like true, kinship and reciprocity with the earth, I think that's only going to train up another generation of people like more well equipped to solve this. And so I think that's yeah, I mean, I just really appreciate that. I think I've come across that like as a topic a lot. And again,
Mhm.
specifically, I think a lot of women I mean, I think about it, right? And I don't have kids right now, but it's something that I think about a lot and it's interesting. It's just interesting to hear you talk about it. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate that. And I'm really excited for you. Congratulations. And April
Thank
is really
you.
soon, but
Yeah.
it's also
And I got
exciting
plenty
and
of time.
you have plenty of time. It's also not that soon. Yeah, it's great. Well, I'm still pulling
Yeah.
for an April 15th, maybe birthday match. But
I'll
as
see
we
what I
also
can.
talked about, yeah, exactly. Kate, this is really
I'll
important.
take that back.
Yeah, take it back, process it, see what you can do.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so your current role now at Environmental Defense Fund (EDF) is we're recording this. I'm trying to be diplomatic. We're recording this in a time where there were a lot of executive orders just released, a lot of potential policy changes at the federal level. I'm so
Yeah.
curious about your role because it is at the state and more local level around
Mhm.
climate action, and I was curious if you could again tell us more about what you do now and then I mean I'd love as much as you want to geek out on like what is happening at the state level, what are you seeing and like what are the possibilities, because I think everyone's kind of
Yeah.
curious about that right now.
Don't tempt me. I think this can become a very nerdy conversation very quickly.
Nerd out, no, let's do it, whatever you want to do. I'll take your lead, but I'm ready.
Awesome. Yeah. So in terms of what I do now, I work with EDF's state climate team. And yes, like I said, EDF big global organization. We work on climate in a lot of different ways, and at a lot of different sort of levels in terms of policy, but also, working with corporations and thinking about a lot of different angles of the problem and levers for change. My team works at the state level. My role specifically is focused mostly on Northeast states. I do a lot of work in New
Mm.
York, but also work in states like Pennsylvania, and some others in the Northeast here and there. Our team is broadly focused on how do we use state leadership and state action on climate to actually like get where we need to go on our emissions reduction goals in the US, sort of laddering up to the Paris Agreement commitments, but,
Mm-hmm.
both doing that like in as rapid and accelerated of a fashion as possible in terms of reaching the emissions targets, but also really integrating thinking on how do we do that in a way that maximizes benefits to communities, especially those who have, for generations, like borne the brunt of environmental
Mm-hmm.
pollution, and are starting to, and increasingly going to see the like harms of climate impacts first and foremost. So I would say that broadly we think about both the GHGs and the tons a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and the intersection of that with community priorities and equity and justice. So my day-to-day work is policy advocacy. I do a lot of work in coalitions with partner organizations trying to advance shared policy goals, and that ultimately is aimed at influencing lawmakers, both governors and executive administrations and legislatures, in terms of how they're advancing climate policies. I That's like a broad sort of description of my
Yeah.
role, but in terms of the landscape right now and the response to the shift in the federal administration, um, there's there's a lot to say, but I think like one broad reflection that I'm having at the moment, is that the first time Trump was elected, there was really like a states picked up the baton and ran with it. That
Mm-hmm.
was an accidental running metaphor, total accidental running
Oh
metaphor.
no, I
Like,
love it. I didn't even catch it. I was like, yes, yes. Okay, great. That was good.
like governors like came together. They formed the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Climate Alliance. The America Was
Right.
All In coalition was formed. The Trump was also elected like right after the Paris Agreement was signed. So that was signed in
Right.
2015. Trump elected in 2016, comes into office 2017. I feel like we were having, as a world, we were having a climate moment in
Mm-hmm.
that decade, and in that time frame. And there was really a lot of like public awareness and energy. It was like Greta Thunberg and Paris Agreement
Mm-hmm.
times, and it was really like climate was a little bit more electric than it feels today.
Hmm.
And you saw like a really big response from governors. And at that time, it was still a lot of like low hanging policy fruit. And what I mean by that is a lot of states put into place laws that sort of set the targets for their emission reduction trajectories. Some of those are like binding and actually really require states to act on those
Hmm.
targets. Others are just more like goals. But there was a lot of states, I think almost like 10 or maybe more, that following Trump's election took like major action through the legislature, signed by governors, put into law. Um,
And they're setting those targets that for themselves, like by them
right,
for them. Okay, that's interesting.
right. And a lot of states are doing that like proportional
Yeah.
to the U.S. nationally determined contribution, which is the U.S.'s commitment to the Paris Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of those like goals in statute are oriented around 2030 and 2050, basically like what is the trajectory that our state needs to be on, um, that's consistent with the Paris Agreement. Um, so my reflection this week, and we're only a week in, I think, to the current Trump administration, um, but it sort of, it's broader than that. It's sort of like the moment that we're in now in, on climate, um, following COVID, following like really challenging economic times, and a lot of inflation over the last few years, is that like this issue is just a lot less electric. It's sort of lower down on the list of priorities for a lot of people in the US. And that's very understandable given like many other sort of macro scale challenges
Mm-hmm.
that people are confronting. And so far, I feel like the response that we're seeing from states is a little bit more like in words only. And that's important. Like, it's important for governors and state leaders to convey the continued commitment we have to meeting the US and like Paris Agreement goals, and keep that momentum on the national
Mm-hmm.
stage. And the the challenge right now is like we actually have to do the hard things to meet emissions targets, and we have to put the policies in place that have a little bit more of have more political implications and have costs,
Mm-hmm.
and like we need to talk about who bears the burden of those costs, and really do hard work to design good policy. Not to say that we haven't been doing anything in the last decade that's like
Sure.
cutting emissions. We've done a lot. States have done a lot of
Yep.
progress, especially in the electricity sector. Um, but we are at a moment where I think like a lot of the low hanging fruit is gone. And I think that's maybe leading to, I was somewhat optimistic in a way that if Trump was elected, it would catalyze a very similar like race to the top amongst
Yeah.
state leaders. And I really am not seeing that yet. And it's a challenge, I think, for us as like environmental advocates, and you know the climate community writ large, to figure out how we kick off that race to the top, given the economic situation that we're in. And I think some of the like we have tried over and over to make the long term economic cost arguments on climate, um, and really like help lawmakers appreciate that action sooner rather than later means lower costs for everyone. But it's
Mm-hmm.
always like really hard to reconcile like this cost of a natural disaster that's exacerbated by climate change over here with like the immediate cost of putting a really ambitious policy in place, and what effect that has in ways that you can like directly model and look at think
Yeah.
about. um and I feel like we're not sort of winning on the on how to like really get at the sort of cost and affordability side of things, and elevate this issue in the context of like the general sort of political and economic climate that we're in right now. But I'm
Hmm.
optimistic. And I'm being long-winded here, so maybe I'll just
No,
like
no, no,
pause
no,
there
no,
so
no. Oh
we
my gosh,
have.
I could listen to you talk about this for a very long time because this is. I mean, what's fascinating, I think, is with your position at EDF, like you're working with these politicians and these government or state governments, but you're not necessarily like it strikes me that you're not necessarily able to like make the policies on your own. Like you are working with like a separate entity to kind of, as you, I know you were saying that you're part of advocacy groups and building coalitions and influencing that way. But as you were talking, it is like it's painting a clearer picture of like, aha, these nonprofits and these entities that are separate from the government are basically having to kind of influence and guide and lead in some cases, but not be able to necessarily implement the policies or themselves. Or is like is that kind of the is that accurate, or are you like besides kind of nudging states in the right direction, like how else can you play a role at EDF if states aren't really,
Yeah.
and not just EDF, obviously I mean TNC, like there's many other kind of big nonprofits and advocacy groups doing this, but that's a real challenge. It feels like if the state leadership is not, and when I say leadership I mean like actual elected officials. Like if they're not kind of rising to the challenge, then that feels
Yeah.
like that's a obstacle.
And I would say that, it's not like it looks different in every state. And I think
Sure.
there are leaders who, and there are like really compelling examples of states who have like gone far and fast on climate.
Yeah.
I think broadly, like Washington and California are both good examples, but there are others as well. Yeah, I think fundamentally, like the role of the nonprofit world and organizations like the one I work at is helping to build the political momentum and the political
Yeah.
constituency for climate action. And that both involves like, sort of the members of our organization and the members of partner organizations and like voters who really care about environmental and climate issues and, demonstrating how broadly these like topics are supported by voters, but also like working with many other types of stakeholders to find common ground on policy, and find, ways that we can advance the priorities of XYZ other constituency through like
Yeah.
this climate bill. So I would say that's like the fundamental work of our organizations. And that really is all about like making it very clear to leaders that um, there's a strong political, coalition and constituency for taking action at the scale we
Mm-hmm.
need. And it's about like sort of informing the policy with science and economics, and also like defending laws once we have them in place and making sure that our leaders are implementing the laws as required.
Yeah.
And EDF has like a big arm of our organization that's focused on that aspect. Not all environmental nonprofits do
Hmm.
sort of the legal work, but that is an angle that we approach it from as well. But I feel like I'm reflecting here on your question a little bit. It's kind of like I think it's coming back to like, what does that mean for the everyday person in terms of how they can
Yeah.
effectuate change against these problems? And
That was like my literal next question. Exactly. So yes. So yes. Great, great segue. Yeah. Like, I mean, I feel like a lot of, just listeners who are broadly in the outdoor space, but also just care about the environment, as we've kind of connected the dots on those two, facets, like outdoor recreation and being outside and active, and a lot of athletes, et cetera. It's like, well, there's a lot of folks that there's a huge overlap with caring about the environment and like
yeah,
caring about the places we get to recreate on. And I know the like I think we talked about this too a little bit beforehand. It's like I don't always ask the like what can people do question, but like since we maybe we'll go there, like like I think there's a lot of folks right now who are kind of like, okay, but what can I do?
yeah,
As doesn't even have to be an outdoor recreation enthusiast. It's like what can just to your point, what can citizens take action on?
yeah. And I like having worked at different sort of levels of policy and thought about this globally and federally, et cetera. Um, I am very much like a state and local action matters way more than people think it does. Um, that old tired saying of like, think globally, act locally, I think is like really, really true
Yeah.
on climate. And it's counterintuitive. Um, and, there are opportunities to think about like what your state is doing and to influence that. Like the everyday person doesn't think about like going to, you know, meet with their elected official, or often like file comments into a public process, or send a letter to the governor. But you can do all of those things, and it's much
Mm-hmm.
easier to do them when you're plugged into an organization, and there are hundreds probably that people can find in geographies near them. So I feel like that's one like very easy opportunity to like find your team, to come back to that connection that I was making earlier. Is like, I think the most important thing you can do on climate is to find your team and then like work with a team on this, because it's scary to like, I mean, it feels huge. It feels scary to sort of be like, I'm just a little person. What can I do against this huge problem?
Yeah.
To the point where I feel like it can turn people off and be like, well, I'm going to vote. I'm going to like, do what I can in terms of my day to day life. But I think like find your team and like start small. And it doesn't even have to be connecting with like an advocacy organization that's going to help you send comments to the governor or, meet with your elected official. Although those things are great. And I think we need as much of that as possible, again, to like demonstrate that political constituency for the types of policies that we need to cut emissions. But it can be like much closer to home things too. And I think there's been a little bit more focus on this recently because a lot of like climate and clean energy transition decisions are coming back to like neighborhood zoning laws in terms of like where does renewable energy get built, or like can we
Mm,
put electric vehicle charging in place, and can we build rooftop solar on these huge warehouses that should definitely have rooftop solar all over them, but like there are all these weird things in state and local policies that sometimes like
totally.
become barriers. So there's so many different levels to this, but I think like within people's neighborhoods there's like the school board, and then there's like the zoning board hearing and the local like planning board, and all of this stuff is a little bit like you know out of sight, out of mind, I think, for a lot of people. But there are really important decisions, even if they're small, like being made at those levels. So I think some engagement, like more engagement from people in their like local community processes, is an opportunity. But I really think whatever shape it takes for you. I know
Mm,
that people are like super limited in terms of like
totally.
time and bandwidth against these problems, and like going to listen to like a public meeting and weigh in a public meeting is like maybe a pretty major lift. But I think whatever it is, it's like find your team and like just start to chip away a bit, like a little bit at a time. And that can take a lot of different like shapes.
Yeah, I love that. I think that also reinforces the idea that like we may not think that things are like that they matter, or
Yeah.
like zone I like listening to you talk about the zoning piece. I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense, and I would never even really connect that into like how I can get involved in the broader, because I think sometimes like at least for me, I do the like too much think globally thing and then like not
Uh,
enough of the local connection. So I love that you said that. That's really helpful. And yeah,
yeah.
like maybe some of those things are, I mean, yeah, they're sure, like a lot of those local opportunities you mentioned, like there is quite a lift in some of them, or like a lot of time. But if someone can put that in, or like is passionate about that, I mean, that's the whole, right? Like
Yeah.
interest and joy, or like what do you get, what are you like, what sustains you in that? And if there's something that's like very locally relevant, I feel like that can kind of kick
Yeah.
it into high gear and be like, this is my thing, this is my
I think
team.
the other thing about like localized action is that your sort of like your influence over that matters more than you would think. Like
Hmm.
it's a very as you go sort of down the levels of government, the group of like stakeholders that matter and decision makers that matter are smaller and smaller, and the group of people trying to influence them gets smaller and smaller. And like, they're having a few people show up that actually like can articulate why they care about the school getting electric school buses, can make a difference in terms of like the school board's decision. You know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
that's why I feel like I have become more and more excited about working at the state level. Still like a huge, I mean, working in New York State, like many actors, many politicians to influence, like many lobbyists and competing interests trying to influence them. But it feels like the voice of my organization and the work that I do is even more impactful than it was at the federal level, and certainly more
Yeah.
impactful than at the global level. And I think that like it's like creating a reinforcing cycle of motivation to to see, like, to engage in policy spaces and decision making spaces where, like, your small little voice of one might actually matter to the outcome of the process. Um, so yeah, that's just
Yeah.
a sort of further reflection on it.
No, for sure. That's super interesting. I also want to, I know we're like, we've talked for a long time and I really appreciate your time.
Like I said,
I
we could
did,
get much nerdier.
I know. Let's go for many more hours. We could always do that. I did in this vein. I mean, you've just talked a lot about like your work and the levers that you're able to pull and the influence that the coalitions you're building have. And I think I am also curious. I ask everyone this kind of as like a closing out reflection of what you're seeing in the space, sort of the idea of like, what is your favorite climate solution that's not yours? And in this case, it's like, okay, maybe it's not, this localized action, this state level policy work. Like, what else are you seeing in this space? Because you have such, I'm sure, like such an interesting vantage point to work that's happening across this country and others. But I'm curious, like, what that climate solution answer would be for you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I feel like I could go so many directions with it. I mean, I get really excited about like all sorts of clean energy tech things and like new ways to do energy storage and like rock weatherization things and
Yeah.
storing carbon in mangroves. Like there's such an interesting space. Like climate is the ultimate interdisciplinary topic, and
Mm.
it's really exciting to see. Like I think over the course of my career, certainly it's just like grown and grown and grown in terms of the like organizations and you know venture funds and like investment in the sort of private side of things and all these ideas emerging. So I'm all about like all types of climate solutions, but I have like a maybe kind of silly answer to this, um, which kind of comes back to like how does like the average everyday person do anything against these problems? Like I think one of the and this is talked a lot about in I'm going to forget the name of that awesome book with all the essays by all the different women.
Oh, the
Yeah, can tell
all we
me.
can save.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's talked about a lot in All We Can Save, but I'll just like lift up their brilliant ideas. Is like art and like inspiration in the sort of climate solution space, and I'm connecting that back to like how can the everyday person get involved in terms of like whatever it is that you can bring to this problem, like lean into that. But I feel like there's so much great like data visualization and
Hmm.
like poetry that like has inspired me in this, and like visuals and art and things that feel like you're um just like building the inspiration for change, and connecting people to it. Um, and I am like not a creative person at all. So anytime that I should give myself a tiny bit more credit. I like to draw
Yeah.
birds, and like sometimes
Yeah.
I can pull that off, but I'm not.
There we
I'm
go.
really like I'm like an analytic thinker and very like I love to be behind my spreadsheets and writing like policy comment documents and just getting the footnotes right. Anyway, like the artist in me is
It's
very, very small.
important too.
Um, so I just like anytime I see like really inspirational stuff, even if it's not like sometimes things inspire me on climate that aren't like climate art. um, there's a couple poems and things that like I always come back to, but that's like a space that I feel like is that's a climate solution that's truly not mine, and I feel like we could just use so much more of.
I love that. Oh, thank you for saying that because I think that's also part of the hope of like this and the media around like the storytelling that I want to like
Yeah,
uplift the folks that come on because it's definitely not art, but like your comment on art is like gets at the kind of like inspirational, hopefully possibly uplifting. Like there's plenty in the world that's out there that's like, whoa, this is really hard. Like this is really
yeah,
whether it's climate or not, honestly. And I'm saying that after like a tough week of news for sure. But um, yeah, I so appreciate that because I think like, especially too, learning that someone like yourself who is like more analytical or more like in, yeah, like in a policy role, like the fact that you're like inspired by climate poems or just poetry in general, I'm like, hell yeah, like that's awesome. So I appreciate that answer a lot. And it's not silly. It's great. It's really important. Um,
Thanks,
like
Addie.
I just so appreciate your time, Kate, and it's just so great to talk to you. And I always love like throughout our years of knowing each other, I always love hearing about what you're up to and like how, you know, where you've gone with your career. So this was also like a very selfishly motivated, like, yes, I get to hear an update. But I
And
will
I'm looking
link to
forward to the next hour about where you're at.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
And you can give
Exactly.
me the whole download.
Yeah, oh for sure. But yeah, I'm gonna link to basically, I mean, everything we talked about. And if, you know, folks want to learn more, they can, and it will all be in the show notes of this podcast. Thank you so much for your time. And it was great to hang out with you.
Delightful to be here. Thank you, Addie.